No, you're just annoying me. Stop it. Wait. Stop it. Wait.
I know you're a big fan of Simon of Montfort. What do you think of his reaction here? Was he upholding the Crusader ideal? Also, what do you think of the Pope's response to all this? How do you think the papacy would have viewed this idea of diverting to Zara?
You know, Simon of Montfort is one of my favorite Crusaders, and I think he upholds the Crusader ideal. The Crusader ideal that sweeps through the military orders and everything like that is that this is for the establishment and defense of Christendom. And Simon de Montfort can't square that circle, so to speak, in terms of reconciling himself to protecting Christians at the same time that he would be ordered to besiege Christians. He can't square that. He can't do that, you know. And I think that's part and parcel to his character. He's a man that is described as being intensely religious. He, as we see later on in the Albigensian Crusade, where he basically commands the whole thing alone and manages this sort of one-man leadership crusade, you know, he is a man of intense devotion. So it's not to be unexpected from someone of that moral character and that religious character to refuse to attack Zara. As for the Pope's response, you know, it's really telling what he says at Zara, but it's even more telling what he's going to say when they move on to Constantinople. But you know, the Pope is one that is looking at this like, hey, is this going to lose us the focus of this crusade? And he's afraid of expending the manpower, expending the resources, expending all of their time, because at this point in time, wars are not usually carried on for years at a time. You know, you march out on your campaign, and because of the logistics of marching a Christian Crusader army at the time, you don't have that logistical support network in place. So I think he's very much worried of the strategic aspects of getting your men to the area and getting supplies to the area. And if you're spending all of your manpower and your supplies attacking Christian kingdoms, he sees the end of a crusade right before it begins. So you know, his condemnation of the attack on Zara is very much in line with its crusading policy up until this point. And you know, we can speak more to Pope Innocent III's actual words when it comes to Constantinople.
Right. Further comments, anybody?
Yeah, just real quick. Something I thought was interesting, and granted, you know, this comes from Geoffrey de Villehardouin. So you know, a guy who was very close with the top tier of the Fourth Crusade leadership. But after Zara is taken, a delegation of the Crusader leaders go to Rome and meet with the Pope to essentially, at least what Joffrey says, to beg his forgiveness for the taking of Zara. And it's interesting that Joffrey almost makes it out like the Pope's response to them is like, well, I get it. You guys felt you had to do what you needed to do. No big deal. Just don't do it again and get to Egypt. In fact, his exact words are, quote, the Pope told the envoys that he knew well that they were constrained to do this because of others' failings. He had great pity for them on this account and sent his greetings to the barons and pilgrims, telling them that he absolved them as his sons. He instructed them and begged them to keep the army together because he well understood that without that army, no service to God could be performed. And he gave full authority to Bishop Nevelin de Soissons and Master John de Noyon to bind and loose the pilgrims until such time as the cardinal joined the army, unquote. So it's almost kind of, at least from Joffrey's perspective, they're trying to show that, that you almost get the sense that Innocent just sort of saw this as a speed bump and was like, okay, it happened, it's done, it's over, just don't do it again.
He had to kind of make do with the way things were.
Yeah, exactly.
He wasn't happy about it, but the idea is, okay, well, let's try to move past this unfortunate episode.
Yeah. And to be fair, we do need to take into account the source from where that's coming from. That may be there may be a smidge of apology
softening
going on.
Maybe.
On Joffrey de Villehardouin's part, but it is very telling that that's the recorded response of Innocent. So
yeah, Zara is going to fall on November 24th. Although we should add the Crusaders did offer them terms at first, which Zara refused. Zara is sacked. The spoils are divided between the French and the Venetians. So the whole shameful episode is carried out in that way. The decision was made to winter at Zara since it was too late in the year to continue the campaign. And it is during that wintering at Zara that our next big turn takes place in the Fourth Crusade. So as Joe, you mentioned earlier, or one of you mentioned this earlier about Boniface of Montferrat advocating for the Crusade elsewhere while this was going on. Was that you, Joe?
That was me, yes.
Okay, yeah. So Joe mentioned that he'd been gone since before the attack on Zara, and he shows up again in December of 1202. And just after his return to the army, envoys arrive from Philip of Swabia, who, as we all mentioned last time, he was married to the sister of the future Alexios IV. Is that correct, Joe?
That's right. The daughter of Isaac Angelos, the deposed king, and the brother of the future Alexios IV.
Right. And then Philip was...
Yeah, the sister of the future Alexios IV.
Yeah, we've got to get these complicated medieval relations right. And
also the cousin of Boniface of Montferrat.
Yes.
So cousin-in-law, essentially, of Boniface of Montferrat.
All right, so we can see here how we've got this whole extended family that is both Latin and Byzantine. And so Boniface returns, and in his wake come envoys from Philip of Swabia, and they have another proposal for the Crusaders. They want the Crusaders to do the incredibly noble thing of restoring poor Isaac II Angelos and his son Alexios IV. Not yet Alexios IV, but his son Alexios, basically. The envoys from Philip want the Crusaders to restore them to the throne in Constantinople. And so the offer is made that if the Crusaders will do this, if they will divert the army toward this task of taking Constantinople for Isaac and his son, Constantinople will submit to the papacy. 200,000 marks will be handed over to the cause of the attack on Alexandria. Constantinople would provide a year's worth of provisions to the crusade. Alexios himself, that's Isaac's son, and Philip of Swabia's brother-in-law, also promised to join the crusade and contribute a Byzantine army of 10,000 troops to the crusade. Joe, you're laughing. To be followed by a permanent contribution of 500 knights to the maintenance of the Holy Land. So, I would just kind of like to get each of your thoughts on this point in the crusade, this diversion, if you will, or this proposed diversion. First we had this attack on Zara, and now this is the next big controversial move by the Fourth Crusade. Let's go attack Constantinople. But it's for a good cause, don't forget that. So, Dr. Schroeder, what do you think of this offer? Let's start with you.
I have a hard time believing that anybody could be so gullible. Given the history...
Yeah.
given the history of the West and Byzantium, which you touched on and we touched on a little bit, there had been good periods. There had been periods of cooperation. There had also been a lot of bad blood between the two empires, or between the West and the Eastern Roman Empire. There had been a lot of accusations of betrayal during the First Crusade. There was was it Isaac himself making, or was it Andronicus making deals with Saladin behind Richard's back?
Actually, yeah, it was Isaac II.
Isaac.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Isaac, the plan they're going to restore is the guy who had a deal with Saladin, and now his son's saying that they're going to pay all these huge amounts of money. I just can't believe these guys were so gullible. I can't believe they believed it. It was a ridiculous offer, and it was particularly ridiculous to think that an emperor was going to just go and impose Latin Christendom on an Orthodox empire. No emperor can do that. And they must have known that. They can't have seriously believed this young man, no matter how nice and well-mannered and everything else he was, and even if he was legitimate and all of that, how could he possibly walk in and say, oh, by the way, how many years of schism is all gone, it's all over, and we're going to now just all be good Latin Christians. It's absurd. And this is where you lose me. I understand we have to pay for the crusade, and as I say, plunder was the standard. Attacking and plundering Christian cities was pretty much standard day of business, or everything in a day's work for a night. But this is a little bit ridiculous. It's also very hard to understand how they could believe they did it. That they did it is another amazing thing, which I'm sure we'll talk about at our next call. But at the time, nobody had ever conquered Constantinople. The huge Muslim armies had failed twice. So it all seems a little bit, as I say, amazing to me. I don't really understand it. Maybe somebody else has something here, more insight than I do.
It is. It's a really fantastical story, the Fourth Crusade. Rand, did you want to comment, or did anybody else want to go next?
Yeah, just real quick. I think Dr. Schrader, maybe in partial answer, and you may not be fully satisfied with it, but I think a partial answer to your question would be the very point that you mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast, and that is the quality of the leadership that was heading this crusade. It does sound like something. Yeah, it's an extremely fantastic offer. One that almost beggars belief that anybody would even take seriously, except perhaps maybe a bunch of young 20-something-year-old minor nobles counts who are have never really done anything like this before. They don't really have any experience with, dealing with foreign power interests and that sort of thing. And here come envoys from the also relatively young Philip of Swabia at the time, who brings this
equally young
imperial claimant to Constantinople with fantastic offers that probably just had them seeing stars as it's being made. So I think that should be considered.
Good an answer as any.
That these were kind of young, hot-blooded, inexperienced guys who they're all sort of buddies with each other, and they go, oh yeah, no, we can totally do that. Without really thinking, without really thinking it through at all.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
I think there's a few more things to be said about this. I mean, you can't overstate just how in need of money the crusade was, and even if they didn't quite believe when they come talking about how we'll give 200,000 marks and 10,000 soldiers and 500 permanent garrison of Jerusalem. They would at least have some hope that maybe if it can come close to that, or at least enough to pay back Venice and to help us with finance, get all the way down to the Holy Land, that at least you shoot for the star, shoot for the moon, land somewhere in the stars, that kind of idea. But
yeah, that makes sense.
There might also be some element of duplicity here. I mean, the Angeli do not have the best reputation for honesty. And
in fact, are you saying they were possibly lying about this offer? Like they didn't intend it.
Alexios IV himself met with the Pope, and Pope Innocent referred to him in writing as a worthless youth.
Pope Innocent got it right.
The fact, and of course, but the Pope and the Emperor, or at least I should say the King of Germany at this time, Philip of Swabia, not quite the Emperor. There was definitely a history of some rivalry there, and so the Pope has his idea of what he wants to happen, and Philip, they have his own idea of what wants to happen. And remember, Philip is both the relative and the overlord of Boniface, and Boniface has both of his brothers had been Caesar, kind of like the honorary second in command of Constantinople, each in their own turn before being first destroyed by Andronicus.
And one of them has been murdered in Constantinople, and the other one had to flee for his life.
And I think we can't overstate too how at this point the Doge of Venice and Boniface, these are the guys who are really at directing the crusade at this point. They're they're the ones who are really in charge.
Yes, obviously he doesn't have to believe that, and I'm sure he knew better than anybody that this was unrealistic for Alexios to be promising. But he still, you could definitely see a trading advantage to having more concessions given to the Venetians, a larger quarter, more escaping imperial dues and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Not to mention that the rest of the Latins, these young idealistic ones from France, were dwindling in number as this ground on, and the higher percentage of paid soldiers led by Boniface and Baldwin of Flanders and others, mercenaries essentially, they were becoming a higher percentage of the total crusading force. Not to mention the Venetians, and the Latins still saw Constantinople as a bit of a golden goose. It was certainly the largest city in Europe by far, about 3 times larger than Venice, and possibly more. Oh no, sorry, more like 4 times larger than Venice, maybe 6 times larger than Paris. It's a large city, and it was very wealthy. Now the imperial treasury was not particularly well stocked at this point, but there was a lot of money in the churches, and there was some reason to believe that they could at least make a fairly good haul from Constantinople.
And on top of what we were saying about Dandolo and Boniface, Jonathan Phillips mentioned that at this point Boniface of Montferrat was actually blocking or doing his best to prevent messengers from the papacy from getting through to the army. He was actually intercepting papal messengers at this point. So did anybody else have anything to add to this?
Just a quick question, actually, because as I say, the reason for taking Zara was to be able to make up for the debt and plunder. Are you suggesting that they didn't get anything out of plundering Zara? That they're financially not any better off? They should have been much better off after taking Zara.
That is a good question. Yeah, my understanding is that the capture of Zara was more about just kind of covering Venice's expenses for the past year, but there was still a lot to be left to be desired to actually execute an assault on Alexandria. Does that sort of square with what everybody else understands about this?
Yes, it does.
Venice took the lion's share of the proceeds from the siege of Zara.
Yeah, Zara was kind of this attempt to sort of get out of the red at best.
Well, and even then, at least from Joffrey's account, he almost makes it sound as if they still owed Venice funds even after Zara.
Right.
So, even the sack of Zara didn't quite fully pay everything back, that they were still in arrears with Venice even after Zara.
And more people had left too. There were high-ranking nobles who had said, "Okay, well, forget it, I'm done." That's going on all this time too. So, Paul, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I really don't think that anybody was ever really fooled by the notion that this was somehow a genuine attempt to restore the Angeli to Constantinople. I don't think anybody actually believed his promises that are completely over the top. And it was mentioned before that Boniface, the Count of Montferrat, was already the Marquess of Montferrat was already intercepting communication between Rome and the army And I'd like to read one of the communications directly to the Marquess of Montferrat from Innocent III.
Yeah.
And this is right after Zara, but just before the crusade is pushed off to Constantinople. There's a particular part in here, and Innocent really calls him out on it. He basically drops all the veil and says, "I know what you're doing. Don't you dare think of it." And it says, "I trust that your repentance is genuine, so that because you are penitent for what you have done, you will be careful to avoid doing anything similar in the future." And that's, of course, referring to the sack of Zara. A person who goes on to commit once again the sins for which he has been sorry is not a penitent, but a trickster. The penitent committing the same sin again is like a dog returning to his vomit. A person who sins once and then returns to commit the same sin again is indeed irresponsible. None of you should therefore dare to assume that it is permissible for you to seize or to plunder the land of the Greeks, even though the latter may be disobedient to the Apostolic See, or on the grounds that the Emperor of Constantinople has deposed and even blinded his brother and usurped the imperial throne. For though this same emperor and the men entrusted to his rule may have sinned both in these and in other matters, it is not for you to judge their faults, nor have you assumed the sign of the cross to punish this injury. Rather, you specifically pledged yourself to the duty of avenging the insult to the cross. And of course, the insult to the cross that he is referring to is the recapture of the Holy Land, and going back to Egypt. So, I mean, Innocent III basically calls him out. And in fact, later in the letter, he goes on to basically say, if you do this, you're excommunicated and we're not going to absolve you. So, right. No one is fooled by this idea of, oh, well, we're going to reinstate the rightful heir and, reunite Latin Christendom. That was all a bunch of smokescreen for Philip, the Duke of Swabia, to gain some influence for his cousin, as Joe pointed out. It was all just the smokescreen and the rationale, and they kind of, it's almost insulting to Innocent III that they thought that maybe that would be good enough of a reason, and that Innocent III would leap at the chance.
Yeah, I'm glad you read that, Paul. One thing I've always thought about the Fourth Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of how the Crusades are interpreted in our own world today, looking back on it, the Fourth Crusade is often held up as the big, proof that the whole thing was, well, look at this, they did this. I mean, the church really comes off looking, I think, the most responsible in this whole thing. Pope Innocent really seemed to hold very firmly to the ideal of what a crusade should be, the purpose of crusading. I mean, if we go back to Pope Urban II, the idea was, stop fighting each other and turn to the defense of Christendom. And I think Pope Innocent really is holding that up here. And, he tried to salvage things after the attack on Zara and that sort of thing. But yeah, I admire Pope Innocent's reaction to this whole thing. So any comments from anybody?
I agree entirely.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr.
No, I just say I agree entirely. I think it's very well said, and it's a good point. I generally have troubles with Innocent because of his crusade against the Albigensian, but here he really did take a stand, and this idea, this was not an attempt by the church to, subdue the orthodoxy.
Right, which that's oftentimes what we hear in popular discussions of this. Oh, I'm sure Pope Innocent was just thrilled to get those Greeks under his rule again, But I mean, that's just not what's going on here. I mean, the Pope is doing what he can to maintain this crusade as a war to for the benefit of all of Christendom. Whereas we have these partisans like Boniface of Montferrat and Enrico Dandolo they've got other plans at this point, and they're trying to thwart the Pope's sovereignty over the crusade. So yeah, just really interesting stuff. The Fourth Crusade it's complicated, and there's so much that could be said about this. Dr. Schroeder?
Jay, I just wanted to add, but this is another point which makes this not a crusade. because
yeah.
by definition, a crusade is sanctioned by the Pope. And in the moment when Innocent comes out and flatly says, restoring the Alexis, all the attack on Constantinople does not have his blessing, it is no longer a crusade.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that Boniface was trying to block communication from the Pope, is because he knew that this was how the Latin world understood crusading. This is something this is sanctioned by the church. You earn an indulgence for it. And so if everybody started realizing that the Pope was no longer on board, that the Pope had condemned the whole thing, and that essentially, you're going to go to hell for doing this, then that's going to cause even more desertions. So I've come to the end of my plan for this. Did anybody have anything else they wanted to add to this point in to the Fourth Crusade? I know, next time we're going to get on to the actual operations against Constantinople, but I wanted to open this up to any further comments from anybody at this point. And there's the silence.
Yeah, I don't really have. We've covered everything so well. There's even been things brought out that I was not aware of. I've never actually read the text of Innocent's messages to Montferrat. That was very interesting that Paul brought that out.
Yes,
and it does just completely cut the knees out from underneath the modernist argument that we hear today. Usually it's whenever anybody wants to bash the Crusades, usually it's one of the big three. It's either the Albigensian Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, and then every now and then the Baltic Crusade with the Teutonic Order.
True. Yeah.
It's like those are like the big three that everybody always holds up, and says, "Oh, Crusades were evil and they were all misguided," and
the bloodbath in Jerusalem on the First Crusade. The idea of everybody.
Don't forget the rivers of blood.
Yeah.
Up to the knees of the horses.
The Michael Bay-esque description of the sack of Jerusalem.
Michael Bay-esque.
Yeah, but
or the cannibalism. Let's not forget the cannibalism.
Oh yes,
yes. That's right. It is, and I like this. I like this argument that the Fourth Crusade was not even a crusade. That it, the moment Innocent came out and said, "No, I do not give my sanction to any of this, nor does the church." And I'm speaking as the as the vicar of Christ, as the heir of St. Peter. This is not. You are not allowed to do this. They are not a crusade, even as they understood even as the people in that time would have understood the concept of a crusade. So it's I agree with that wholeheartedly.
I think there is a lot to be said for the fact that the leaders of this crusade are people of, and they started out initially, they wanted to have, this mostly French-led, and there were certainly a lot of French nobles, but by the time things start going off the rails, it's Northern Italians, essentially, the people who have the least respect for the Pope because of their proximity, and the fact that they're being torn between the Pope and the Emperor, the German Emperor, in their loyalties. This is where that the Welfs and the Ghibellines, that struggle first arises around this period.
That's a good point.
And just the disrespect for the Pope.
Yes.
Yeah, it goes from. Go ahead,
Italy has also been fighting with the Byzantine Empire much more frequently. There's been more tension there.
Oh yeah,
and between France and the Byzantine Empire.
Venice has long-running, feuds and sort of turf wars with the Byzantines. So, yeah, and I think too, as someone mentioned earlier, the problem that this is called the Fourth Crusade. So, anybody who's kind of going through the numbered crusades, they kind of run into this one, and it's confusing. And the whole numbering system is. It's kind of an unfortunate relic from a more simplistic time. I think it was kind of around the Victorian era that the numbers were come up with. I could be wrong about that, but
it's definitely very Gibbon-esque.
Right.
Even you've got other things like that from medieval history. You've got the idea of the idea of the 100 Years' War.
Right.
When really it was a series of conflicts that involved different players at different times. It was not this one monolithic, conflict. It was actually a series of conflicts broken up by truces and ceasefires and treaties and all this kind of things. It's a very early modern history tends to do this simplistic.
Not to mention the Wars of the Roses, which nobody at the time would have thought of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure. A bunch of roses fighting each other. Yeah. Right, sure.
All right.
Yeah,
All right.
good
So
stuff.
this one's coming.
So, does
to a
anybody else have
close.
any comments, or I think we're kind of coming to the end here.
Yeah, you're coming to the end.
Well, I think the it was actually German historians in the 1500s, the 16th century, who actually numbered the Crusades.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
That
I'm not
sounds
sure
very
exactly who-
Germanic.
Yeah, I know. Jonathan Riley Smith. He's in one of his books. He said the second.
Rest in peace.
I'm sorry.
So rest in peace.
That's absolutely rest in peace, Jonathan Riley Smith. He said in one of his books, and this was always a sore point for him, was the numbering of the Crusades. He said something like the Second Crusade is actually like the Seventh Crusade or something. Like if you actually look at the Crusades that were called in between, 1147 and 1095, there's quite a few. Like there's several called to Spain, several called to the Holy Land between then. There was actually a crusade that's referred to as the Venetian Crusade in the 1120s.
Oh, there we go.
Captured Tyre.
Nice.
But
It's in the background.
So yeah, really interesting stuff. This was a great panel. I really enjoyed getting to hear from all of you and hearing the interaction of the ideas. So I'm just going to say thanks to each of you. Rand, as always, thanks for helping me with this. It's great to have you.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to always be on.
All right.
Joe, I'm glad that we've...
They're just saying their goodbyes. There you go. All right, gentlemen. I got a bone to pick with you. Especially... All right, now I don't have a bone to pick with anyone. All I just want to say is you see that there? All gods are imaginary. You notice how all capital letters, all uppercase, all gods are imaginary. Now, particularly regarding Jesus. Jesus is a composite of all the apocalyptic street corner preachers that were around at the time of the Romans, at the time of the Jews and the Romans clashing. The Jews and the Jews clashing, and the Jews and the Romans clashing. So there were a lot of these apocalyptic preachers around, preaching the end of the world. It's coming, well, this chaos that we're living in is too much for you. You don't deserve it. You deserve to all go to heaven, and pretty soon you all will be. Well, that's a story that obviously didn't pan out. A promise not kept. Was Jesus a politician? Perhaps. Well, in terms of keeping promises, might have been, but we all know for sure that he was just a composite of all the apocalyptic preachers around the time. So there was not one particular person called Jesus. It's a composite of all the preachers. So you can be rest assured, Wesley Curry II, that the Jesus that you think of in your mind is all imaginary in your head. So if there's any chaos with Jesus, if there's any anger or letdown or anything at all to do with Jesus, it's all in your head. And everybody who believes that a Jesus actually existed as a God, the same thing. You're all imagining it in your head. So there you go. Now you are all caught up. And you are much wiser now, Wesley. I don't even know if you're watching still. Wesley Curry. Oh, we have a visitor. Wesley Curry, I don't know if you're even watching. Wesley Curry, are you watching? There's 3 watching. Is one of them Wesley? I don't know. But I just wanted to say, before we carry on, that the absolute historical fact is that the whole Jesus movement is it's a business. It's nothing else than a business. Because if you believe in Jesus, you got to pay money, right? If you join a church, you got to pay money. And the church doesn't believe in Jesus. There's no way. There's absolutely no way that any theologically trained person who has done his own work and he's cross-referencing can actually believe in this Jesus God person. When I think about it, the whole idea of, you know, the creator of the universe and the cosmos and like everything that's in it is whittled down into this person from 2,000 years ago who, the story goes, is actually the creator of the whole universe, born of a virgin and all that, you know, because that's important according to the Christians. Christians have an incredibly twisted and warped attitude towards sex. There is some weirdness there for sure. We're suddenly going to the dentist. Good one, Bill. Okay. Well, now that we've established that all gods are imaginary, Jesus is a myth, Moses is a myth. Let's go through the whole. Let's go through the history of myths. Okay, so Adam and Eve, myth. Who comes next? Noah, a myth. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that whole crew, myth. Who comes next? Abraham, Jacob. Then we have no one other until Jesus, which is a myth. And then we have Allah, myth. Carrying on, because now we're not done. We're only in the 700s. Carrying on, we have the 1515. I think it's 1515 split between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Reformation, bang, split. Hatred on all sides. But they all believe in this ridiculous nonsense about Jesus. Then we get, remove that guy, and then we get probably a whole bunch that I'm not remembering, but we get to North America in 1830 something, and we get Joseph Smith and his Mormonism. Again, Joseph Smith brings up a story which is a myth, another myth. We carry on, and I think you will find that it's primarily North America. You get all these Scientology and Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventist, Methodist, Baptist, evangelical, presuppositionalist. What I've probably missed out a whole bunch, but can't think of everything. So there you go. Looks like Wesley Curry II has met his match in Bill Pazdu and has exited stage left, which gives us an opportunity to carry on with the siege of Constantinople. Are you ready for the siege of Constantinople? Because I am. We've done that one. Cool. There we go. All right, let's enjoy the siege of Constantinople. So remember, Zara was 1202. Constantinople is 1204.
Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. I'm going to be hosting. My name is J. Stephen Roberts, and this is the third episode in our latest podcast series, The Fourth Crusade. So we have gone through the calling of the Fourth Crusade and the attack on Zara, and we have come to the siege of Constantinople. I guess technically there are two attacks on Constantinople, but that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm happy to welcome back with us for this episode one of our regulars, Dr. Helena Schroeder. Dr. Schroeder, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Excellent. And we also have with us our resident Byzantine history enthusiast, Mr. Joe Vizinanzo. Joe, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So we're going to jump into the offer from Alexios IV, or rather from Philip of Swabia, his brother-in-law, to divert the crusade once again, this time to Constantinople. So the offer from Alexios IV, received by the Crusaders at Zara at the close of 1202, was quite attractive. The Venetians accepted it, as did the upper leadership of the French forces. However, this caused enormous controversy in the army, and many of the rank and file were extremely uncomfortable with the idea of flagrantly disobeying the Pope's orders. More desertions followed, but a large number did agree to this diversion. And the primary reason was that the alternative, the dissolution of the army, was unthinkable to many. Now, Pope Innocent, on receiving news of the decision to advance on Constantinople, responded with an immediate bull of excommunication. Boniface of Montferrat blocked this bull from being propagated among the army, while the clergy that was traveling with the crusade appealed to the Pope on this decision. So I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Dr. Schroeder. What do you think of this decision to attack Constantinople? Is there any way that this could be reconciled with the ideal of the crusade?
I don't think so. I think I've said before, I don't think this was a crusade from the time that they diverted to Zara. So, and as I say, there are legitimate strategic reasons which you hint at or have mentioned of, trying to keep the force together and make enough money to go on crusade. But that applied to Zara. I think it applies less to Constantinople. This is a pretty audacious undertaking. As I say, nobody had succeeded before. I question whether the leaders of the crusade had any idea what they were getting themselves into. But it must have been very obvious that if you're taking Constantinople, which is a huge undertaking, that you're not going to go on to Alexandria. We talked about this last time. How credible was his offer of all these troops and might? I don't think it's credible. I find it very hard to believe that anybody at this point really believed they were doing this for the sake of Jerusalem. I think they had allowed themselves at this point to be seduced by the idea of taking Constantinople, whether it was for the Latin Church or whether it was for their own gain.
Yeah, what do you think, Joe?
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, a very large portion of the crusading force either went home or went on to Syria, or made their way, separated themselves from the main force of the crusade to the point where it's actually primarily Venetians who ended up, sailing on to Constantinople with a much smaller force of crusaders.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that the largest portion of the actual Crusader force clearly did not see that this was something that was in line with the ideals of the Crusade.
Yeah, good comments from both of you. And I know later on as we get further along in the notes here, yeah, it is overwhelmingly Venetian, the force that actually does end up involving itself in the attack on Constantinople. So the Crusaders departed Zara in April of 1203 and were joined by Alexios, the son of the blinded and deposed Isaac II Angelos, at Corfu. By May, they were approaching Constantinople, passing before the sea walls and disembarking across the Bosporus on June 24th. Initially, the Venetians tried to get the citizens of Constantinople to simply proclaim Isaac's son Alexios as emperor by parading him before the city walls on a Venetian ship, but the citizens on the walls just threw rubbish at him. This is actually kind of one of my favorite parts of the whole thing. It's just kind of amusing. So, Dr. Schroeder, why this reaction to our young hero Alexios? Was his claim less legitimate, you think, than Alexios III Angelos, or was
Not
it...
at all. I mean, they're both basically, this is the nephew. They're throwing it, and he is the son of the elder brother. So there's no question about legitimacy here. What's going on here is that the crowd of Constantinople, or the population of Constantinople, is notoriously fickle. They always support the winner. And as soon as they smell blood, they'll attack someone. I mean, they tear Andronicus apart. And we'll soon see as we go on here that as soon as Alexios III flees, they immediately drag out, Isaac, and they proclaim him emperor again. There's absolutely nothing particularly. This just says nothing. The other thing is people throwing objects at somebody. How many people? You have a city of, I don't even know what we're estimating. Joe, you tell me what was the population of Constantinople?
It's about 400 to 500,000. So
it's huge. So
they weren't all out there doing
4,000 or 5,000 people out there throwing things. That's nothing. It doesn't mean that other people weren't waiting in their homes hoping and praying that he would come back. Not that I think that was the case. I'm just saying the evidence of the fact that you could get people on the walls throwing refuge at somebody doesn't prove what the sentiment of the majority is. Regardless, as I say, I don't think they were particularly cared one way or the other. But certainly, as long as he's outside in a boat and doesn't have control of Constantinople, I'd be mad to show any support for him. I mean, this is just self-interest. If I'm a citizen, even if I hypothesize that somebody in that city, as I say, which I think is quite unlikely, was furiously and passionately in favor of restoring young Alexis and his father, I certainly wouldn't show them that sentiment as long as Alexis III is still in control of Constantinople.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Dr. Schroeder. One of the issues that we have to look at here is that there was plenty of factional struggle going on within Constantinople itself. There wasn't just one mood or one feeling about how things should go, and that has a lot to do with why there was so much change of power within the city as events were progressing outside the walls with the Venetians and the French. So, Joe, did you have any comments on that particular issue?
Well, yeah, the population of Constantinople had a lot to do with the actual appointing of emperors, in particular the religious orders and the monasteries in Constantinople were extremely influential. There's a really interesting book by Anthony Caldelis, a Greek historian or Greek-American historian, called The Byzantine Republic, where he lays out the case for the idea of Constantinople essentially continuing the old Roman tradition of the emperor is kind of like grafted on top of this large bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy keeps churning away, doing what it's going to do, and no matter who is on the top of the heap, it doesn't really change the actual operations of the state too much. But
it's not. I'm gonna object a little to the title about democracy or whatever, because this is a matter of mob rule. This isn't a matter of people coming together and reasonably debating who they think is best. This is a matter of people, coming together and getting a crowd together and whipping up sentiment and then going and plundering palaces.
There's a bit of
Sorry?
both. And certainly later on, when the kind of the noblemen and the religious leaders in Constantinople actually did have a large meeting in the Hagia Sophia, and effectively elected a new emperor who lasted for about 2 days. The next year, there's a bit of that. There was a bit more of like the mob violence. And all that.
Yeah, the mob had a role to play in Byzantine politics, obviously, and as we kind of mentioned last time, different factions could use the mob toward their advantage, and so it's just one piece in this power struggle that tends to go on. So on July 6th, the Crusaders stormed the defense work at Galata on the opposite side of the Golden Horn, which is Constantinople's chief port. They break the harbor chain that defends it. They then marched up the Golden Horn, rounded the end of it, and camped outside Constantinople's land walls. The Venetians, meanwhile, occupy the harbor. On July 17th, there was a general assault, which failed to take the city. However,
the French assault fails miserably, but the Venetians actually do manage to take a number of towers along that seawall, which is hugely important, so that they get control of the towers. So this is not just as though they've an assault that's been repulsed and then the emperor flees. They actually have established a foothold, a bridgehead inside the city, and they've defended those through the day. When night falls, they're still in possession of those. That's a hugely important factor, because in fact, even if they haven't captured the entire city, they have made I'm not going to say a breach in the wall, but they've established a foothold inside the city. And that's more than any other assault had managed to do in, I don't know how many thousand. Well, what do we think?
I'd like
How
to
many
talk
years?
about this a minute.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Joe, what was that?
Oh, I just said, I would like to talk about what exactly happened there with the assault on the walls.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have some comments to add to Dr. Schroeder's, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's real interesting exactly how it happened. First, the Byzantine navy was completely non-existent at this point. The Megaduke of the navy, who was Alexios III's brother-in-law, had essentially just sold off the navy over the course of the past decade in order to enrich himself. So there was absolutely no sea defense of Constantinople at the time. Now, Constantinople was protected on from the landward side by the largest system of walls in Europe, and one of the largest in the world. Certainly, had never been taken before by any of the many besieging armies. But on the seaward side, the Golden Horn, the walls it was only a single layer of walls rather than three, and there was no. And they were significantly smaller because they were expecting to be defended by the sea itself and the fleet that usually set out.
Yeah. Exactly.
And the point where the Crusaders actually assaulted was an area called the Blacerne. From the landward side, it's the only spot where there is no moat in front of the walls, and the whole quarter of the Blacerne actually kind of juts out from the regular from the city, such that from the land and the sea, it's essentially you can attack from either side, so the defenders have to go in two different directions.
Okay.
There is an imperial palace stuck up there in the Blacerne Palace,
which one can still visit today, which is quite beautiful.
Yes. But so it was a bit of a hard point. But if you were going to attack anywhere in the city, that was going to be the best spot to do it. So the defenders of Constantinople figured that the Crusaders would be the tough ones. So they placed the Varangian Guard on the landward walls to fend off the Crusader assault, which failed miserably, as you said. But the Venetians, led by Doge D'Angelo, who themselves had visited Constantinople several times in the course of their lives. A typical Venetian sailor would have been there a few times. They were familiar with the area. They assaulted directly at the sea walls, which were lower and were only defended by some light missile soldiers, archers and such. So they actually did manage to seize about 20 towers on the walls. And then when the Varangians were called from the Crusader side, from land side, to kind of push them back, which they did, the Crusaders were able to kind of slip in there. So it was just a poorly managed defense of Constantinople. So the Crusaders actually did manage to get several thousand men into the city, and they were looking pretty good for a little while, until about almost the entire defensive force led by Alexios, the emperor himself, counterattacked, or I should say, appeared to be readying a counterattack. They didn't actually do it, though. Geoffrey de Vieredouin actually talks about how this was like a miracle from God that they didn't actually assault, because they would have destroyed them all. There was about 2,000 Crusaders inside the walls and about 10,000 Byzantine troops readying to assault. But instead of actually pulling the trigger and coming down on the Crusaders, as they really should have, Alexios just basically turned his men around, and they allowed the Crusaders to retreat. So never really sealed the deal. And then, of course, it was at that point that Alexios, in the middle of the night, ransacked the treasury of 1,000 pounds of gold and fled. So.
Okay. Yeah.
So Joe, my question for you is: so why? Those are the bare facts, that he did pull back, and he flees in the night. But what made him decide that it was now futile to defend his city? I don't expect you to have an answer, but speculate a little.
I'm not sure that he actually believed that it was futile to defend the city, but I do feel like I do think it's entirely likely, probable even, that he was facing a lot of resentment among the nobility and the people of Constantinople, and he was actually more afraid of them than the Crusaders. He was certainly not a man who particularly seems to care about the defense of the city itself. He was definitely in it for the money. He had, as I mentioned, his brother-in-law had stripped the navy down to brass tacks just for to make some extra spending money for himself. And he just ransacked the treasury and left. I think that he saw where the mood of the people of the city was going and got out while he could.
Okay.
Yeah, those are really interesting comments, Joe. I appreciate that. What this whole episode strikes me as is kind of a continuation of what we've tended to see with the Angeloi anyway. This sort of plundering of the empire while carrying on these various petty civil conflicts. I do think a lot of what happens here with the Crusaders showing up at this time is they kind of were at Constantinople at the right time. Possibly a lot of previous armies who had attempted to take Constantinople could have done it in this situation when it was so poorly defended, when there's no naval defense. It kind of sounds like what you're saying, Joe, is that the Crusaders, especially the Venetians, were able to assault the walls and the defenses of the city from a point where most other armies had not been able to approach in the past. Right. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, and I do think that they themselves, it was just almost like a civil war in a sense, because the Venetians, they had their own quarter of the city.
Right.
Your typical sailor would have traveled to Constantinople several times. They were familiar with the layout of the city and the way the defensive structures were laid out.
So that was the point of just immediately breaking the harbor chain and just getting to this point that the Venetians were familiar with. So interesting. So now we're going to get to this issue of numbers. It's worth noting that by now the number of actual French participating in this enterprise was drastically reduced, as you were mentioning earlier, Joe. The strength of the Frankish contingent was now around 500 knights, 500 sergeants, and 2,000 foot. So this amounts to about 30% of the French force that had originally departed Venice.
I think that Dr. Schroeder has a good point when saying that this is looking less and less like an actual crusade and more like a Venetian military adventure. Yeah, certainly after Corfu, when Boniface basically had to break down sobbing to get anyone to come with him at all, and just trying to salvage something of this whole thing. And yeah, it doesn't really. Yeah, it just looks less like a crusade and more like, I don't know, payback, I guess, for the Massacre of the Latins or something.
I think it does kind of say something about how the Crusades were viewed more generally by Latin Europeans, that so many of the French refused to be involved with this. There was kind of this very strong sense of what a crusade should be, as opposed to this idea that's projected onto the Fourth Crusade by people looking at it from our own time, who will maybe want to use the Fourth Crusade as sort of an example of how really the whole thing was kind of corrupt. The whole idea of crusading was kind of corrupt. But really, the way the Fourth Crusade goes does kind of tell you something about how generally there was this feeling that, you know, a crusade couldn't be a war against Christians.
Yeah, it's exactly it. I'm saying this wasn't a crusade. It's when they couldn't pay for the ships at Venice. It stopped being a crusade there. And the attack on Zara and the attack of Constantinople have nothing to do with crusading. The point about the numbers is that not only am I saying that as a historian looking back at it, but that the contemporaries of the Crusaders strongly felt that way. This is not, you know, an analysis by an academic. This is the way the people living there at the time thought about it. They didn't see it as a crusade. The numbers involved are also tiny. I mean, we're not talking. It's not just that it's a third of what had gotten left Venice. We're talking, you know, and remember, not enough people came to Venice in the first place, and the crusade itself wasn't that large. You know, 500 knights. I mean, God, Richard could pull that together for an attack on any, you know, castle he wanted, right?
Yeah.
Henry II in his wars would have easily been able to pull together 500 knights. You know, this is let alone the Holy Roman Emperor or Philip of France. I mean, that's just not that big a force.
Yeah, it's almost like at this point the Venetians are sort of operating with a small mercenary force of French knights or something like that. That's really what we're looking at this point. So the leadership of the crusade now decides to winter at Constantinople and prepare for an attack on Alexandria the following March, or officially, I guess you could say. At this point, as we said earlier, Alexios IV was on the throne now. The son of Isaac II Angelos had been crowned Alexios IV. And he needed the help of his Western allies, the Crusaders, to help him stabilize his government in the meantime, because he didn't have full control really over Constantinople. His government really was not very stable at this point. So at the same time, the clergy are also sending letters to the Pope and the kings of Europe, assuring them that they still intend to proceed to Alexandria. Alexius himself wrote to the Pope, assuring him that Constantinople was now under the Roman Catholic Church.
Which the Patriarch would have had something to say about.
Right. And I'm actually not sure what the Patriarch did say about that. Do you have anything on that, Joe?
Well, there was actually a debate about who was the Patriarch at this point. Alexius to impose his own candidate, but the old one refused to step down. The monasteries, which, as I say, were very influential in Byzantine politics and were extremely wealthy, they flatly rejected the notion that they were now going to be under the authority of the Pope. And this definitely turned the city against Alexius right from the beginning.
Alexius, he's the emperor, and he assures the Pope that Constantinople is now under papal authority, except nobody else agrees with him on that. So the situation deteriorates rapidly at this point. The Greek clergy and population of Constantinople bitterly resent this Western presence. There are riots. Alexius could never fully gain control of his government, and he quickly was unable to make his promised payments to the Latins. The Crusaders even delivered an ultimatum to the young emperor in November of 1203. But by January of 1204, a coup broke out in the royal palace, and Alexios IV was strangled to death by a fiercely anti-Latin faction. This faction gained control of the city and raised to the throne a great-great-grandson of Alexios I Comnenus, who took the title of Alexios V, and he is nicknamed Murtzuphlus. He's kind of known to history as Murtzuphlus. Murtzuphlus cut off all ties with the Latins, who still had their main camp outside the city. Their deal in ruins and their army locked out of Constantinople, the crusade had the funds neither to return home nor to proceed to Alexandria. In March, the Council of Leaders determined that they had one course left: the capture of Constantinople itself and the subjugation of Byzantium. So, Joe, what do you think of this? What are your thoughts at this point?
Well, there's a few things. Murtzuphlus, whose name actually means unibrow, because apparently he had a bit of eyebrow situation going on. He had actually been involved in an attempted coup in 1201 with John Comnenus that attempted to kick out Alexios III and failed. He had actually been in prison for some time, and Alexios IV actually had got him out of prison and put him in charge of the imperial finances. And he was actually working for Alexios IV for a while, trying to get the money together to pay back the Crusaders what Alexios had promised them. But yes, as you said, these there was a lot of unrest. They did not like the idea of paying all this money to the Crusaders, the people of Constantinople, and so they got together and elected an emperor called Nicholas Canavas, who, as I said, lasted about 2 days. And Murtzaphlus was actually sent to put down the revolt. Instead, when he got there, he decided that they had a good point and basically turned around, joined them, and had Alexios strangled. First, well, not strangled, I should say. There was debate. They tried to poison him a couple times, and they shot him with an arrow, and they might have strangled him too. Like he was actually kind of hard to kill.
Poor guy.
And then Isaac, the old blind emperor, he, according to Geoffrey, dies of a broken heart, which probably means he was stabbed in it. But but yeah, so like this was a huge mess. Like they actually the people of Constantinople were extremely anti-Latin by this point. They actually sent out fire ships to try to destroy the Venetian fleet, which failed. And large portions of the city was burned down in rioting between the Latins and the Greeks before the Greeks were all kicked out of the Latins were all kicked out of the city by Murtzaphlus. So by March, like there was really nothing else that the Crusaders could do. They couldn't really move on. They hadn't received all the money that they had been promised and had personally put into the investment. There were fewer of them than ever to pay back the Venetians, which the Venetians, by the way, had been handsomely paid by Alexios IV as soon as he got into power, and there was just very little left over for the Crusaders. So yeah, by this point they just figured, all right, we've got this new guy. They've killed the old emperor the emperors that we put on the throne. They've been breaking the promises that the emperor had made to us, and now it's the only way we're going to get our payback is by actually assaulting the city and taking it by force.
Good comments there, Joe. Did you have anything to add to that, Dr. Schroeder? Or?
Just a couple things. Reminder that the anti-Latin sentiment had flared up in Constantinople a number of times over the centuries. I mean, we can go back to the other Crusades, but just looking at Manuel the First, etc., he had actually thrown the Venetians out in 1171 to actually placate widespread anti-Latin sentiment in the circuit. Manuel I was actually pretty pro-Latin, as I say. He married two of his nieces to Latin kings. He took part in the Crusades against Egypt. He wasn't fundamentally personally against the Latins. So he was actually responding to popular sentiment against the Latins when he threw the Venetians out in 1171. Again in 1172, 1182, there's the massacres of Latin. So, this is something that's it's not all that unusual. And the bottom line is here also, Geoffrey de Villandron talks about the early months everybody being actually quite friendly with one another, which I think is also possible. But you can bet that if the Venetians had now come back and finally gotten their revenge, they were probably, enjoying that and maybe showing off that they were now in, and they probably aroused an awful lot of resentment that was maybe latent already. But I think that, of course, the fundamental thing is this idea of putting the church under the Latins. There's nothing riles up people so much as trying to make them change their religion. I mean, I don't know how many wars in the history of the world are about religion, because people, if they believe something, they don't take kindly to somebody else telling them to believe something else, or even to just worship in a different way. Religion is a much more fundamental thing than just who's king. I mean, you could ask yourself the question, would it have come at least so rapidly to a break between Alexius IV and the Crusaders, or the Latins, because I don't like calling them Crusaders, if they had not tried to impose the Latin rights? We have the case of Cyprus. Richard I takes Cyprus, and he basically says, look, guys, I'm going to leave everything the way it is, except you pay me instead of paying Isaac Jimenez. And everybody says, fine. And then the Templars come in and try to impose the Latin Church, and they have a revolt.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to go back and reconquer the island. It's just one of those things that's very, very stupid. It's politically stupid. And you wonder why Alexius IV even pretended to follow it, because, as I say, the Pope wasn't interested in taking over Constantinople. He made his point very, very clear. He didn't even want it. So why on earth would Alexius have tried to impose that? It's another one of those things. I don't understand Alexius IV. I don't know if he was playing a double. I suspect that he was only saying that because he wanted their help, but he thought he needed to say that, and that he didn't shift fast enough away from his own position. Maybe Joe has some insight on that. But those are the only 2 points I wanted to add.
Yeah, what do you think of that, Joe?
Yeah, that's very true. Obviously, that resentment for a lot of things, even before the Fourth Crusade, there was a lot of resentment of the Latins among the Greeks. So it seems that Alexius, the only reason why he was actually following through with his attempt to put Constantinople under Roman authority was probably just because the only thing that was keeping him in power was the Crusader force, was the Latin force. Like, the people of the city didn't particularly want him there. He really relied on the Crusaders for his power, for almost his legitimacy even. So it's probably just to suck up to the Crusaders, not really thinking exactly about what the people of the city actually wanted.
Yeah, he was certainly a man with few options. Were you about to say something, Dr. Schroeder?
I did want to point out that what Joe said about Alexius V, as I can't say his other name, had previously
I love that name.
Been in charge of the finances suggests to me that at least for him, it was seeing all that money flowing out of the city that may have been a major factor. But then again, you said he'd already he tried to revolt earlier, so that actually negates that thesis. It sounds like he was basically waiting for a chance to revolt anyways, and saw himself as a better emperor, and simply awaited his opportunity. But maybe the information he had about the treasury was something he could use to help rile up the mobs.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly possible. He might have his previous revolt against Alexius III, he had actually been doing it on behalf of a member of the Comnenus family. It may be that he just didn't like the Angeloi altogether.
Not such an unreasonable thing.
Yeah. So as we kind of come to this this big final push, the Venetians and the French, this push they make against Constantinople, I did want to mention the numbers because I think that's pretty interesting. We've already mentioned the 3,000 French fighting men. That's all that's left from the original, muster of French forces at Venice before the departure. A tiny fraction of what had originally gathered there. The Venetians had about 12,000 combatants. And in addition to this, we've got about 15,000 Latins who have been expelled from Constantinople and sought refuge in the Crusader camp. Of these, there were around 6,000 fighting men. So in all, we've got, an army of around 20,000, fairly small, and a big chunk of that is made up of Latins who had been living in Constantinople. And of course, the biggest chunk of it is Venetian. Joe, your summary about the first attack was really good. Did you want to summarize this attack now?
Well, let's see. The attack was made from the sea, almost entirely from the sea walls. They had already established that was the weak point. The Venetian ships were pretty kind of marvels of technology for the time. They had a couple hundred siege engines, ballistas and catapults and such things, including Greek fire launchers and others.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Ships themselves, the ships had castles that went up about, in some cases, 30 feet high, which is almost as high as the seawalls themselves. They could and did in several cases basically put down large walkways from the ships, for the ship castles, directly onto the walls to discharge soldiers. So the initial assault did fail. The Varangian Guard, which is about at the time about 5,000 Northern European, English, and Danish soldiers, who they were mercenaries, but they were the personal guard of the emperor, had been for several hundred years by this point. They actually put up a pretty good fight, despite the fact that they were outnumbered. But the rest of the defending force really was not so great. They were essentially, it was a very political force. The Apsikian theme in Constantinople had for a long time been essentially the place where you go to try to advance in politics, and wasn't necessarily the crack troops of the empire, because the city was considered to be basically impregnable. So with the Varangians there, the emperors hadn't really worried about an assault on the city for quite some time. So while on paper there were about 15,000 defenders of the city, it was really essentially the Varangian Guard that did all the heavy lifting. We saw in the first instance, the first assault, wherever the Varangians went, they were able to stop up the gaps, but they had to basically be shuffled back and forth across the walls, which, miles of walls, and having people run back and forth along them is tiring in itself, and they can only be in so many places at once. So wherever the Varangians weren't, that's where the Venetians and Crusaders were actually able to establish a foothold on the walls, take towers, and kind of gradually creep along, forcing the defenders back. Not to mention that they also would use, especially the Venetians, where they would start large fires in the city, partially with the help of their siege equipment, and this caused a lot of chaos. The smoke billowing everywhere. It's really hard to negotiate the city near the walls, because there was a lot of there's buildings built up right into the walls, built right up to the walls. Many of the streets were pretty narrow. It's a medieval town, so just lots of chaos. No one really knows what's happening. The Crusaders are assaulting several places all along the wall, all along the seawall. They can kind of sail a ship down the wall, try to shoot at almost an equal level at the walls themselves, at the defenders on the walls. So, so essentially, as things started getting pretty ugly in the city, and Murtzaphlus basically pulled the Varangians back to defend himself and cover his own retreat. So once the Varangians were pulled off the walls, it was pretty much all over. There was nothing really that the rest of the defenders could do. So over the course of this, this all occurred over the course of a day and a night.
Right.
When the defenses really came down. In fact, it got to the point where the walls were so undefended in many places that the Crusaders were actually just able to start with crowbars and things, disassembling and making holes in the walls for people to crawl through. So, just a lot of chaos.
Yeah, really interesting. So, at a certain point, it's that night of April the 12th to April the 13th that Murtzaphlus, he just makes his withdrawal and attempts to just flee. So did you have any comments about the actual assault, Dr. Schroeder?
No, that was very well summarized.
Yeah, that was excellent.
I still stand in awe, because I've seen those walls, but Joe's made a really good point about assaulting from the sea, and that those walls aren't as, this isn't the multiple lines of defense. And I think also really appreciate him pointing out that this wasn't, in fact, the Byzantine army in the same way that you had at earlier assaults, where everybody pulled back to defend Constantinople because they felt they were threatened.
Yeah, it's very different. This happened a long time ago, but the assault in the 7th century and the 8th century from the Arabs, it's so different. It's such a different story. And in that case, you really had this unity, that you get this feeling of unity of Constantinople really like you're saying, Dr. Shar, just coming together to resist this, and we don't have that at all in this case.
Yeah, even the final assault in 1453, when the Ottomans finally took the city, there was actually a smaller defensive force. There was only about 9,000 defenders, and the Ottomans had a much larger force, somewhere around 80 to 100,000 men. And the Byzantines put up such a fight in that instance. Everyone pulled together. The emperor died, in the defense, to the point where the Ottomans didn't even record the number of dead because it was so many. They didn't consider it, particularly glorious victory. And that was with the help of the largest cannon that had ever been built at that time. So it's really surprising, almost that the Constantinople went down so quickly, so relatively easily in this instance.
Yeah.
But as I think you've done a good job of explaining it. It's because people hadn't expected it. In other words, when they pull back, when they're facing the Ottomans, when they were facing the earlier assaults, they knew that they were under siege. This was Christendom under siege. Here, they've completely underestimated the Venetians. They've pushed that. They actually have. The Venetians tried to revenge the expropriations and arrests in 1171, and they're easily brushed off by the Byzantine fleet. And I think there was a great deal of complacency on the part of the Byzantine as a whole, that they just weren't going to have to. This wasn't something serious. And as you say, if what you had, most of the troops in the city weren't really the crack troops because they were out defending the borders, then the whole balance of power begins to look somewhat different.
Right, that's very true.
Yeah, and I remember reading in Jonathan Phillips' book about the Fourth Crusade that there were a lot of people in Constantinople who were never even really aware that this was sort of a foreign force invading the city. There were a lot of people that thought it was another civil war.
Which essentially is what it became.
It was, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, it was at least, but the first assault, because they were simply putting Alexios IV on the throne. So that was an internal power struggle, a dynastic struggle.
Yeah, and that
with
kind
mercenary help.
And that kind of thing had really been pretty rampant in the empire over the past couple decades with the Angeloi. So you can see why that would be the impression that some people would get. Joe, so I know we hear this idea sometimes that in 1453, actually there was kind of this last moment of unity between the Byzantine and Latin clergy, that they sort of came together and celebrated Mass together as the city was falling. Is that true, or is that more just a little?
That is true. In fact, they attempted to actually launch another crusade to save the city, but it failed. Unfortunately, it never really got off the ground. It was led mostly by the Hungarians. And so in 1453, there was definitely a sense of unity. The Pope tried to call for the defense of the city as well. And even the leader of the defense, aside from Constantine XI, the last emperor, was a man, Justiniani, a Genoese general and merchant. So the Latins and the Greeks came together at that point. Certainly not at this point, though.
Yeah, that's just kind of a beautiful moment, I think, in that final catastrophe for Constantinople. You have finally these two factions that had been struggling for supremacy stopped arguing about who was going to dominate and just celebrated their common faith together. It's kind of beautiful and tragic at the same time that's ultimately what it took to sort of put that aside. But yeah, we have a very different situation here in 1204 with just this total inter-Christian conflict we've got going on here. We're kind of coming to the end of this third episode for this podcast, and next time we're going to get into the actual sacking and destruction of the city and talk about the legacy of the Fourth Crusade, which I think that's going to be a very interesting discussion. I do want to ask the two of you if either of you have any final comments for this particular episode.
I guess the one last thing is that they had, by the time that they decided to really assault the city, take it for themselves, the Crusaders and the Venetians, or at least the French and the Venetians, had come to an agreement that they were basically going to share power. That this was going to be they were going to divvy things up, and if they would have a Venetian patriarch, they would put a patriarch who would be from Venice. And the new emperor would be from the Crusader force, the French force. So yeah, by this point they were kind of just fed up with dealing with the Angeloid and other Byzantine nobility, and decided that this was going to be, from now on, they're going to take control directly.
Which brings us to the point that if they're talking about taking control in Constantinople, they've given up any thought of going on to Alexandria.
I think so, yeah.
this is I mean, the whole absurdity of this small number of people. I mean, if you're talking about 500 noblemen, 500 knights are going to rule the entire Byzantine Empire. I mean, not just Constantinople. At this point, they're going to go in for the jugular. They're going to put themselves up as emperors, and they're going to, with 2,000 or you say 3,000 men, rule an empire that stretches from the Balkans to Anatolia.
There wasn't that much left at this point, but yeah. But that's actually one really interesting thing about this assault on Constantinople is right before that happened, they did have these rather elaborate planning sessions where they sort of came up with how they were going to divvy up the Byzantine Empire and the government. It's almost, I mean, it's pretty cynical, but at the same time it's also kind of an example of this Latin efficiency with government and compromise, I guess. What do you guys think?
I would say that they were definitely better at coming to quick and decisive decisions than the Byzantines were.
Yeah, but I still think it was very, very unrealistic to think they were going to, with what the forces they have, be able to dominate an empire of that size. It's
oh yeah, it's.
I don't know if I
crazy.
call it naive or what you call it, but all right.
But that's what they intended to do, apparently.
They managed for 50 years, right?
Yeah, and we might kind of touch on this in the next episode. The history of the Latin Empire is remarkably dismal. This is sort of the high point, really. Is this capture of
the population of Constantinople went from 400,000 to something like 40,000. So, in that 50 years,
it's brutal. Yeah, it's horrible. Okay, well, I guess we've kind of come to the end of this. I'm really glad you two were able to talk with me about this. This was absolutely fascinating. Joe, I want to thank you for being here. It's been really good having you for this podcast because of your knowledge of Byzantine history. You've been an obvious choice for it. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and thanks. I learned a lot, Joe. Thank you.
Good to know.
Definitely. And Dr. Schroeder, of course, I want to thank you for being with us. It's always good to have you here.
Don't have much to add to these ones, but happy to be here.
Well, I think you've got some great comments, so I'm glad we're able to have you on. Dr. Schroeder, would you go ahead and let everybody know where they can find you online?
The best place is at www.defenderofjerusalem.com, because my real expertise is the Crusader kingdoms of Jerusalem, particularly at the end of the 12th century. So, and of course, the 3 books that I've published are also about that period, Knight of Jerusalem, Defender of Jerusalem itself, and the most recent book, Envoy of Jerusalem. They are all available online, both in and paperback format.
Absolutely, and those will be listed in the info box for this podcast. And yeah, I just want to say thanks to everybody for listening. This is Real Crusades History. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. And we will be back next Monday with the final episode of the Fourth Crusade podcast. So I'm looking forward to that. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage? A novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Please click on the link in the About box of this video to get your copy. Also, if you would like to support Real Crusades History by offering a donation, you will find a PayPal donate link in the About box of this video. Thank you. Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. My name is J. Stephen Roberts. I'll be your host. Tonight's episode is going to be the final installment in our Fourth Crusade podcast series. And the topic is going to be the sacking of Constantinople in 1204 and the legacy of the Fourth Crusade. In our previous podcasts, we have discussed pretty much the whole course of the Crusade. We talked about the calling of the Crusade, the attack on Zara, and we talked about the attack on Constantinople itself. And now we're going to talk about what happened once Constantinople actually fell, once the city was put to sack by the Latin invaders, and kind of what happened in terms of history's memory of the Fourth Crusade, how the Fourth Crusade is remembered, the impact it had on history, and its place in the Crusades as they're remembered today. So let me go ahead and introduce our panel for this podcast. Rand Brown is with me. Rand, how are you doing?
Pretty good, man. Good to be on.
Great. And we've got Joe Vicinanzo back with us. Joe, welcome. Thanks.
Hi, thanks a lot.
And Paul Copenhagen will be joining us as well. Paul, glad to have you. How are you doing?
Glad to be back. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the topic. Following the fall of Constantinople in April of 1204, the Venetian and French troops, as well as the western ex-residents of the city, put Constantinople to sack. This went on for 3 days. Most medieval cities taken by force were sacked, but there was a particular obsession with loot in this army engendered by the debts to the Venetians. At least that's what Jonathan Riley Smith thinks. A large portion of the sacking army was made up of Latin ex-residents who felt particularly vengeful after having been expelled from the city during the siege. That's kind of interesting. I thought that was sort of a noteworthy aspect of the sacking of Constantinople and, indeed of the siege of Constantinople. There were a lot of Westerners involved in the attack on the city who had been residents of the city and had been, in fact, expelled from Constantinople by the Byzantine government, as a precaution during this Latin siege. So as we've come to this point in the podcast, we've really covered all the major events, and I really just want to get some thoughts from each of you about, the sack itself. The sack obviously is an incredibly controversial event. There were obviously atrocities committed that have gone down in history as incredibly negative stains on the legacy of the Crusades, if you will. Although, as we've kind of established in previous episodes of this podcast, it's sort of controversial to even refer to the Fourth Crusade as a crusade, considering the fact that it really derailed and went against the wishes of the church pretty early on. So I would like to ask each of you your opinions on the sack. Joe, I want to start with you. What do you think of the sacking of Constantinople? Was this your typical medieval sack? Was there something unusually ruthless going on here? What do you think?
Well, it was by no means a typical sack. This was the largest city in the Christian world by, orders of magnitude. Constantinople was about 400,000 people at the time when Paris was about 60,000. For the Knights of the Crusade, and more importantly for the Venetians, this was the big kahuna. This is the ultimate prize. There is nothing else that they could have actually come into contact with that could offer the sort of opportunity that they saw here. The taking of Zara was one thing, and they thought that was a pretty substantial haul, but Jeffrey de Villardouin, he talks about how he says that in his estimation, 2/3 of the wealth of the world was held in Constantinople. Clearly, that wasn't the case, but it was the biggest prize that anyone had ever seen. Any of these people had ever seen. Many of them, of course, were very young and had never seen any sort of city of the sort. So, yeah, they went a little bit nuts.
So it's kind of like the temptation was just too much. I know Jonathan Phillips talked about how immediately after the city was captured, there was sort of this effort made by the Greek clergy to appeal to the sense of Christianity in the Latins and get them to, maybe just take over the city without actually putting it through this horrific sack, but that appeal was lost on them.
Right, and a large part of that was because you're dealing with a whole bunch of young men who've been sitting outside this boring city, like in a boring siege outside this city for a year and a half, and you're dealing with these people who have different set of ideals than they do, who treat their have a different approach toward government than they do. They don't have that same sort of primogeniture ideology that the Franks would have, or even, and certainly didn't have the sort of governmental system of the Venetians. A lot of them, just young men, didn't really know what was going on. They figured these guys, they're out of communion with Rome. They're to them, they're the next. I think that over the course of the time that they spent outside Constantinople, they developed a pretty good disdain for the Greeks, and took it out on them in the final events of the sack.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, we have to remember too that this was sort of an army in a state of desperation. There was almost no alternative for the leaders but to sack the city of its wealth in order to deal with their financial problems. So, Paul, I'd like to move on to you if you have some comments. Do you have any comments about the actual sacking of the city, the atrocities, the grabbing of the relics? What are your thoughts on all this?
If anything, this really does underscore the fact of what we've said before, that this really should not be considered a crusade. Sacking a Christian city to this magnitude, to this level, destroying the holy places as well, really puts into my mind, when I was reading the accounts on this, that this is very much a secular army assaulting a city for the sole purpose of plunder. I think you kind of touched on it as well just a moment ago when you mentioned that they sort of were at this point of no return. Sitting outside the gates, they had a choice. They could go home in shame and heavily in debt, possibly facing extreme censure from the church for having even gotten that far. They could have gone back, and that would have been a terrible death knell to their entire endeavor, as well as to any claims of legitimacy as crusaders. So they could have gone home completely in defeat without anything to show for it, or they could press on. They could sort of go big or go home in this instance. And they decided to go big, and they did it with the biggest city, as Joe mentioned, in the Eurasian continent. They decided to go for this, and that was what happened. I think that's what drives them to the levels of depravity that we see. I think that is what brings them to the decision to go ahead and go through with it, despite the threats of excommunication, despite all of the problems that are going to be inherent with destroying and sacking Constantinople. Of course, they don't go as far as destruction, but they basically decide to roll the dice and hope that they can back everybody into a corner. And this is where arguably the biggest criticism of the Fourth Crusade comes from, because instead of following up on the excommunication and the complete condemnation of the entire act, Innocent III is now put in a very difficult position of, well, what do I do now?
You're talking about once Constantinople has been conquered, once the Latin Empire is sort of up and running, if we could even say that.
Yeah.
And he does kind of accept it as
he's
part of Christendom.
He kind of accepts it, and he starts writing letters to French bishops and monasteries to basically say, well, hey, let's make the best of a bad situation and bring Latin books and Latin theology out there. So that he starts asking for learning to send it out to the Byzantine Empire to try and at least make the best of a bad situation, and demands the returns of the relics.
Yeah, interesting. One thing I've always been curious about, I've read a lot of the big primary sources involved with this. How seriously can we take, for example, some of the Greek claims about, soldiers putting a harlot on top of the altar and that sort of thing? I mean, that almost seems like maybe a little bit cartoonish.
It does smack of propaganda.
I mean, I don't doubt that horrible things happened. You know, I just wonder if it was to that extent that, you know, inside Hagia Sophia, you have French knights dancing with whores and having them drink out the chalices and, you know, fornicating with them on the altar and that sort of thing. I mean, that seems like a little bit over the top. But I guess you agree with that, Rand. What do you think, Joe?
Well, you know what? In any situation, the problem is that in this particular situation, actually, that a lot of the people who we are calling Crusaders really were mercenaries. Most of the majority of the people who had volunteered for the Crusade in order, you know, to take up the cross and actually, you know, get to the Holy Land, kind of under their own steam, they had moved on. They'd abandoned the Crusade at this point, or they would have, as they would have said it, they had actually continued with the Crusade. Boniface and Baldwin, so Boniface of Montferrat and Baldwin of Flanders, the two most powerful nobles in the Crusade, had a large number of mercenaries with them. Mm-hmm. So they, you know, people they had hired right before the beginning of this whole thing, just kind of round out their numbers. And those guys had been sticking around the entire time. They were not the ones who were deserting. So even among the vastly diminished Crusader host, the people who were left were relatively few Crusaders and were largely mercenaries. So I don't necessarily discredit the idea that these mercenaries who suddenly, after the long time that they've been sitting outside these walls, not doing anything in particular and getting kind of fed up with the situation, I don't necessarily think that it's unreasonable to think that they committed some very serious atrocities, including, you know, I don't know, in churches. But yes, it does sound a bit, melodramatic. The idea of it's just the sort of thing that is always said about like what happens when, your enemy takes a place is that, they put children on spits and things like that.
I would need to clarify my stance, because I don't entirely, I'm not entirely in agreement. It's a little bit, I have a little bit more nuanced thought on that. But yeah, mostly what Joe is saying is very correct. It's there were probably some very isolated incidents where, some really, really nasty stuff went down. But then, the people who knew about that, word gets out. You play on a mass societal scale. You play this game of telephone,
right,
that just expands exponentially, and you get stuff like in the opening actions of World War I, with German troops were skewering Belgian babies on bayonets and all this kind of stuff, and it was like, okay, it wasn't like that. It wasn't quite.
But some children got killed, but not so.
But at the same time, he's also very correct in that, this was a mercenary army, and this was no longer a Crusader army. The guys that were in this army they were the ones who stuck around after all the papal censure, after the more idealistic factions had already taken off and discussed and left, and all that kind of thing. So these were guys who really, really didn't care about any religious affiliation whatsoever. These were guys who war was their business, and if they took Constantinople, business was going to be booming.
Right.
It was going to be the payday of a lifetime if they took this city. So. You're not going to have, I have no doubt that the guys who actually sacked Constantinople, they were not Crusaders in any sense of the word, like at all whatsoever. Yeah. These were professional mercenaries, and in the medieval world, professional mercenaries were extremely hard bitten. Were an extremely hard bunch of dudes. These guys were guys who did not have any qualms whatsoever about looting churches, sacking monasteries, stripping altars of everything that was worth anything, and they probably didn't hang out with the the most genteel of circles, So
Yeah.
in their spare time, and as somebody who's still in this line of work, I can tell you that has not changed at all. So it's um, there's something about that it's just a historical constant of human warfare. So
yeah, very, very good points, guys. So once the sacking was over and the plunder had been divided, at that point, the Latins pretty much implemented this plan they'd made ahead of time to divide Constantinople between the Venetians and the French factions. An emperor is elected. And my understanding is the Venetians were going to have direct control of the patriarchy. So a Venetian patriarch was actually elected, while a French emperor was going to be elected. So you're going to have a French, Latin emperor of Constantinople. And apparently one of the early choices, and it seems obvious, was Boniface of Montferrat, but the Venetians actually blocked him as a choice. That's kind of interesting. And
Right.
My understanding from what I've read is that is because they considered him to be someone too connected already to the Greek world. He had too many contacts and allies already within the Eastern world, really the Byzantine world, if you will. Which we talked about some of his involvement in his family's involvement in that in previous podcasts. So Baldwin the Ninth of Flanders is instead chosen, and apparently the Venetians felt he would be easier for them to influence, if you will. So, just some comments from you guys on that. Rand, what do you think about that? Well, first of all, does anybody have any comments specifically about the Boniface of Montferrat thing? Or
Yeah. Well, Boniface was the vassal of Philip of Swabia, the king of Germany, and who was at the time trying to become the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He tended to have very direct connections to the Germans. He also had a lot of connections among the Crusader kingdoms. He was related to just about everybody. It's no wonder that the Venetians did not want Boniface in control of Constantinople, because he would have most likely not really been a puppet, a pawn of theirs. He would have would not have been dependent on them for his power.
he would have had his
Baldwin,
own vision of things, possibly.
yeah, and yeah, definitely had his own vision of things. He was conspicuously absent from the siege of Zara. He had never really been a big fan of the Venetians. He had gone along with it because he was, the one who had been put in charge of the crusade, and that was the only route that he really saw forward. But he was never really an ally to the Venetians, and by this point, Venice was really in charge of the whole debacle.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. So, Rand, did you have any thoughts on this issue, the establishment of the Latin Empire and the choice of the emperor?
Yeah, it's I think what the Venetians were trying to do is they were trying to avoid replacing one difficult one difficult regime with an even more difficult one that would have been even harder to control. Had they had Boniface assume the throne. You're right, he was extremely well connected, and if his connections with the Holy Roman Empire had achieved the sort of success that they were hoping for, they ended up not. But I think the Venetians were looking at that going, if this guy gets in and his relative and Philip of Swabia becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, like, we will have created a monster that we won't even remotely be able to resist. So that's why they go for Baldwin the Ninth, who is, even in somebody as apologetic as Joffrey of Villehardouin's chronicle, is not made out to be the most mature um, savvy leader by any stretch of the imagination. So I think they just kind of went, hey, we can kind of control this guy. Let's back him. As far as the formation of the Latin Empire and it being a realistic goal for the Westerners in Greece, I think overall, yes, you've got the Venetians, you've got the Venetian factor at play, and as we know, even according to, I think it was Plato who said this, but money is the sinew of war and all that kind of thing. So the mercantile interests in this are a big deal, but I think really ultimately it was just we're here, let's make the best of it. Let's see how far we can go with this. In a way, the formation of the Latin Empire in Constantinople almost becomes this mocking shadow to the Crusader kingdoms in Palestine. It's sort of the same impulse. It's we're here. Let's see if we can preserve what we've won, and of course it was completely devoid of any of the the ideological nobility of the actual Crusader kingdoms in Palestine. But this was very much a move of expediency to see, I guess, how long the payday could keep coming.
It's almost a bizarre, perverted parody of the First Crusade in some respects.
It is very much so, and it's almost tragic in that sense to see to see where it went. As far as it being a realistic goal, absolutely not. I mean, I think there were probably even people there at the time who were probably waiting for the other shoe to drop, and for this thing for the bottom to give out on this thing, because it was so shoddily put together. It was you even get that sense from the chronicles from the time. Almost immediately Baldwin and Boniface get into conflict with each other, that even comes to actual blows.
And Baldwin's going to be captured by the Bulgarians pretty much a year after he's crowned emperor. I mean,
and they're surrounded. Not only are they surrounded by hostile neighbors, they are sitting on top of an extremely hostile population.
Yeah.
And culturally, socially, politically, everything. It's just that it was a ticking time bomb from the start. And so yeah, was it a realistic goal for the Westerners? No. I really think it was just a matter of capitalizing as much as they possibly could on what they had won.
Yeah, good point. The interesting thing for me about the Latin Empire, quote, is, the Latin Empire itself has a pretty dismal history. Really, the whole thing. There's several states that are established. I mean, we've got the Kingdom of Thessalonica, which of course is where Boniface, that's sort of his consolation prize for not being made emperor of Constantinople, and that only lasts for like 20 years or something like that. And then there's some territories that sort of exist in some form or another for several centuries, like the Duchy of Athens, I think it is. When I was actually in Athens last summer, and there were some old photographs they had there which actually showed at the side of the Acropolis this Latin tower, basically, that was there for centuries. And I guess it was taken down by some German classical enthusiasts during the 1800s or something, something like that. So,
never trust a German historian.
Right. Like they thought it was this mar on this classical Greek monument to have this giant Latin tower there.
Yeah, thanks, Byron.
Yeah. Very, very well put. So that's kind of interesting. Does anybody have any further comments on the viability of the Latin Empire, sort of its rather dismal history? Paul, Joe, did either of you guys have anything to add to that? Or
yeah, well, it was doomed from the beginning. It's just grafting on this whole new set of people who, some of them had cousins who had been in the upper echelons of Byzantine society earlier, but most of them were complete strangers to the people there. They had just actually taken the city by force and eliminated the old, not only the old imperial family, but the entire aristocracy was essentially exiled, forming, three different kingdoms: the Empire of Trebizond with the Komnenoi, the Emperor of Nicaea with the Paleologi, and a Despotate of Epirus over in the east, the Adriatic. Essentially, they had very little. They had very little actual control of what had been the Byzantine Empire. Most of the citizens of Constantinople left. It wasn't even a question of fleeing. Much of the city was burned down during the sack, and no one really wanted to be there after that point. Over the course of the next 30 years, the city went from 400,000 people to 40,000 people, if not less than that. Constantinople was a shell of itself under the Latins, and the people who were so unlucky to call themselves the emperors of the Latin Empire never really lasted very long. Really, in the next 40 years, the most powerful player in the region was the resurgent Bulgarian Empire. The Bulgarians were the big, the heavy hitters for quite a while, until for a brief period when the Greeks took back over under the Paleologi in the 1260s, took back over. But then, of course, the Turks really came to the fore. But yeah, for quite a while there was Baldwin was dead within a year. Boniface, who became king of Thessalonica, was dead within 3. No one really came out of this looking or doing too well. So
yeah, it's like the actual taking of Constantinople was pretty much the high point, if we can even describe that as a high point. But it's incredible. I mean, and the contrast from the Crusader states in Outremer is just incredible too. I mean, the Crusader states in Outremer, the governmental structures that were established there were much more stable. And one thing that was a key to the success of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is that, Baldwin I of Jerusalem, as soon as he got into power, one of the first things he did was establish the local Christians as being able to practice their rights right alongside the Latin clergy. Something like that was rather impossible in this situation, just because there was this just unavoidable tension, I guess, between the Greek and Latin factions here. I did want to move on to you, Paul. So much has been made of the Latin sack of Constantinople as being ultimately responsible for the final collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. This is certainly a claim that seems to have been made by Stephen Runciman in his History of the Crusades. He kind of points out the sack of Constantinople, the conquest of Constantinople in 1204 as this is the moment when it really becomes irreversible for Byzantium. What do you think of that, Paul? Is that accurate?
I don't think that's accurate at all. There's several sieges of Constantinople. Neither one of them that are after the 1204 siege. Neither one of them really particularly weaken Constantinople beyond the point of recovering. There's a couple of other factors that really go into it and play far more of a part in the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 than this siege and the establishment of the Latin Kingdom. Because if you think about it, the Latin Kingdom is in and of itself nothing different than the establishment of a new dynasty in the Byzantine Empire. Arguably, the biggest effect is what Joe mentioned, with the population dropping down to a shadow of its former self, 10% or so of its former self. However, populations rebound within generations. So, we're talking about a period of 250 years from 1203 to basically 1453, during which the population has a chance to rebound, the economy has a chance to rebound, and we know that economies and we know that populations do explode to the point where you can see that very definite resurgence within 250 years. The biggest things that really that really lead to the 1453, and this is why I have a real problem with the Latin kingdom assertion is what led to 1453. The real problem with the end of the Byzantine Empire is really that the focus leaves the Holy Land in 1291 with the fall of Acre. And then you have in 1307 the beginning of the trial of the Templars, which is the first real major successful challenge of church power and authority by a secular power, being the Kingdom of France. And you have that breaking of the church power, which is the center of the crusade. You have the entire endeavor in the Holy Land basically back to where it was in 1095, pre-crusading era, because there's no more crusaders in Outremer. And then you have this very large series of political upheavals that go from the trial of the Templars through the 100 Years' War into the Wars of the Roses. And it's a real problem when your two big contenders in the Crusades, France and England, that can consistently field armies, can consistently send thousands of troops overseas, these two are now locked into their own internal squabbles for over a century, and that momentum of crusade dies. And that's really what leads to 1453. Certainly the bad blood that is sown by the Latin Kingdom means that relief is probably not going to be coming anytime soon, but really the West is just too busy with its own problems at this point.
Interesting. Some really good points there, Paul. Does anybody have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, leading up to 1453, I think there's a very good argument to be made that the division of the empire that occurred at that time is not that the empire became less wealthy. The people there were still the wealthiest in Europe and in most cases the Middle East as well. The political control was what was actually divided. There, below the political level, at the level of just basic trade and commerce, things did continue on fairly well and did actually progress in many ways. And there was a bit of a renaissance that actually did take place after the fall of Constantinople, about 50 years afterwards, and continuing on after that point. But unfortunately, because the political division was so severe, the Turks, of course, under Osman later on, were able to consolidate and gradually kind of eat up the smaller, almost feudal, not exactly feudal, but almost feudal remnants of the Byzantine Empire, of the old Roman Empire. Basically just taking over in a dynastic way, just as a dynastic change, taking over these things, not even really having to conquer them particularly, to the point where the Turks did think of themselves in some sense as ruling over Rome. That's why in 1453, the Sultan, when he finally took Constantinople, assumed the title of emperor, of imperator, autocrat, and Basileus, the emperor of Rome, and the people who were under the Turkish yoke at that point were for the most part for hundreds of years. Even the majority of them were Christian. Yeah, the political divisions that really were engendered by the turmoil after the fall of Constantinople in 1204, what I do believe were what enabled the Turkish advance.
So, kind of what you're saying, Joe, is that in the wake of 1204, we do have these different sort of Byzantine statelets pop up, in opposition to the Latin Empire, and there's three of them.
To each other.
And to each other, yeah. Was some of that kind of going on and starting to happen really under the Angeloi too? Because
absolutely,
because
absolutely.
In the 20 years leading up to the Fourth Crusade, we do kind of have sort of that process going on of that decay of the Byzantine state. Yeah, do you see some of that?
We absolutely had. There had been several attempted revolts against the Angeloi in the previous decade and a half before the Crusade. And of course, the Fourth Crusade itself could be considered essentially just another Byzantine civil war. So yes, that's why it was so quickly just divided up among these prominent families, the Komnenoi, notably in Trebizond, the farthest from the capital. The previous rulers of the city, Paleologoi and others. But yeah, the government of those places continued on without really any particular interruption. It's just that there was no, they lost that unifying factor, and by the time they got it back under Michael Paleologus in the 1260s, it was too far gone, and everyone in the area, the Bulgarians and the Turks, had advanced to the point where they just could never regain that that local hegemony. So
interesting. Yeah, great comments from everybody. So as we kind of come to the end of this discussion, I wanted to put this question out there. What overall legacy did the events of the Fourth Crusade and the brief existence of the Latin Empire have on the history of relations between Eastern and Western Christianity? And this was actually a question you came up with, Rand, and I thought was a really good one, because this is the thing that always comes up when the Fourth Crusade is discussed. I mean, it's sort of this sore point still between, modern day Catholics and Orthodox in some respect. So I know that's a huge question. That's a huge topic. I don't want to sort of overwhelm us here at the end of the podcast, but does anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, how has this been sort of this long-term wound between East and West? And anybody who wants to go first, just go right ahead.
I'll go ahead. I'll go ahead and jump in here, seeing as how it was my question. It's funny that the whole reason I even came up with that question is, not only in our time of managing Real Crusades history, we've seen it in the comments, and anytime you read something that's disparaging of the Crusades, it always without fail mentions the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople, and the Latin Christians turning on the Eastern Christians and all this kind of thing. And there is amongst the Eastern churches, amongst the Eastern rites to this day, there is very much this palpable sense of grievance over the sack of Constantinople and the events of 1204. I even experienced a little bit of that even personally when I was in Jerusalem here just this past summer. I tried to have a conversation with an Eastern Orthodox cleric in the Church of Mary and Jehoshaphat, which is right there at the base of the Mount of Olives. It's a beautiful Crusader, a beautiful church built during the Crusader period. It's a vault that goes kind of down into the ground, big Norman vault that goes down into the side of the Mount of Olives, and it was a very popular burial site for noble women of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. To include, probably the most notable is the burial site of Queen Melisande herself. And when I tried to have a conversation with this Eastern Orthodox cleric about it, he feigned ignorance on any of that and pretended to not know anything what I was talking about, had no idea who any of those people were, had no idea where they were buried or anything like that. And it was, at first I thought it was just an isolated incident, but then the more I interacted with the Eastern clergy out there in Jerusalem, I got the same response with anything related to the Latin Crusader presence in Jerusalem. It was like they didn't even want to talk about Latin Crusaders, or anything related to them. And it was there that it kind of really did hit me that it was like, wow, this is very palpable. Like this is still very real, like even today. And I think really what it probably comes from is a sense of betrayal. I think there is an idea that the events of the Fourth Crusade, here, Latin Christianity was supposed to be helping their Eastern brethren, with the scourge of Islam. They were supposed to be brothers in arms together, and instead they turn into a bunch of mercenaries and they sack they sack the Second Rome. And I think something like that, it's very easy to, perhaps, maybe in an exaggerated sense over the centuries, but I think it's very, it becomes very easy to finger that as the reason why we now have to put up with 500 years of brutal domination by the Ottoman Turks. Why the jewel that was Constantinople is no longer, and all that kind of thing. I think it's a very emotional point culturally, and I think that's really where you see it. Even to the point where you have popes now. John Paul II, apologizing, for the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Yeah. So it's like, I mean, this is something that is still very, very palpably felt amongst Eastern Christians, and perhaps a little unjustly, perhaps not, but cultural perceptions aren't really too terribly concerned with the details. It's perception is reality.
Yeah.
And I think the perception is that this was a betrayal of one of the worst types, and that is not going to leave a social and cultural consciousness anytime soon.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Rand. And I think, if we're just looking at it historically, I mean, it's really not a fair conclusion to make, because the truth is that both sides kind of betrayed each other consistently. And, the events of 1204, as we've sort of discussed in this podcast, were really brought about by all kinds of happenstance of history and decisions made, both in Byzantine and Latin politics that sort of resulted in this in a way. But yeah, does anybody else have any comments on this? I imagine Paul and Joe, you guys have something to say about this issue.
Well, Pope Innocent III does have something to say about it. Right after the fall of Constantinople, I should say the year after, in 1205, Pope Innocent very, very much did not approve of what had happened. And, he basically saw the future. Here's the quote here. How indeed will a church of the Greeks, no matter how severely she is beset with afflictions and persecutions, return into ecclesiastical union and to a devotion for the Apostolic See, when she has seen in the Latins only an example of perdition and the works of darkness, so that she sees now, and with reason, detest the Latins more than dogs? As for those who are supposed to be seeking the ends of Jesus Christ, not their own ends, who made their swords, which they were supposed to use against the pagans, drip with Christian blood, they have spared neither religion, nor age, nor sex. They have committed incest, adultery, and fornication before the eyes of men. They have opposed both matrons and virgins, even those dedicated to God, to the sordid lusts of boys. Not satisfied with breaking open the imperial treasury and plundering the very goods of princes and lesser men, they also laid their hands on the treasures of the church and, what is more serious, on their very possessions. They have even ripped silver plates from the altars and have hacked them into pieces among themselves. They have violated the holy places and have carried off crosses and relics. So the Pope, who, many people have accused of, entirely unjustly, of course, but, of benefiting from this whole thing, definitely spared no words in condemning what had happened. And, frankly, I don't know how the incest part got into it, but hey, he really went after the Crusaders and the sack here. So, but particularly pointing out that, of course, the Greeks are never going to come back to us. Like, this is like, people do say that 1054, when the Great Schism, when the Pope and the Patriarch both excommunicate each other, that's the beginning of the ultimate schism. But really, it's 1204. That's why we don't have a united church between Orthodox and Catholics. That is the single largest nail in that particular coffin. So,
well, that may be true, Joe. I think that's probably kind of a complicated question, and I think it's probably debatable that's the reason. I mean, I think it's possible. Yeah, go ahead.
Theology is one thing, but murder and rape and theft is something that actually appeals to people on a much more visceral level. So when you're talking about keeping the churches apart, from the Greek perspective, I think that no, that's what the Latins are about. That's the sort of thing they do was probably a more effective argument for the average person than the fact that they include the Son in the it proceeds from the Father and the Son in the creed. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, this is kind of a huge subject. I mean, I just wonder if there was really any chance of the Greek and Latin churches being fully united, if that was really a realistic goal at all at any point. I mean, it seems to me like well before 1204, there was considerable sort of divergent paths that these two religious traditions were on. But sorry, go ahead, Rand.
Go ahead. Something that needs to be brought up is, and I know it was brought up in Paul's comments about whether or not the sacking the sack in 1204 was ultimately responsible for the final collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire. Something that does need to be said is there was a little bit of a coming back together between East and West right before 1453.
That's true.
There was, especially amongst the Italian city-states, there was the Genoans set up a permanent shop there in Constantinople. The Venetians set up permanent shop. I think there was another one that was out there. I can't remember which one, but there was kind of a somewhat of a reconciliation, and you even saw quite a bit reconciliation between actual Western Europe and Constantinople. There's an excellent account of one of the emperor. I think it was one of the Paleogioi. I know I just butchered that, but who visited England during the reign of Henry IV. In the late 1300s, early 1400s, and he was welcomed with this great fanfare, and they celebrated him as the Emperor of Rome, and he was very well received even by the English clergy. But the problem was this was right at the height of the 100 Years' War between England and France, and although the emperor, I can't remember which one he was, but even though he appealed to Henry IV for aid against the Turks, it was kind of like, hey man, we'd love to help you out, but we're currently busy at the moment. Mm-hmm. And there were even quite a few French knights who still went east to go help the Byzantines fight off the Turks. It was incredibly unsuccessful. The biggest episode was the Battle of Nicosia, or Nicopolis. The Battle of Nicopolis in 1380 something, I want to say, where French, a Franco-Hungarian coalition essentially went out to go stand up against the Ottoman Turks, and it was even called in many quarters, it was called the Crusade of Nicopolis, and they were just crushed by the Turks. The Battle of Nicopolis was just a horrific disaster for the Western forces that were trying to relieve Constantinople, and it basically gave the Ottoman Turks free reign over the Balkans and the entire Danube Valley there. So it was there were further attempts to try and shore the rift, to try and come back, to try and help each other out. So much so that, actually the majority of the forces fighting within Constantinople during the siege of 1453 were Westerners. They were Italian troops who were there for who were there in the trade the trade sectors. And they actually formed the majority of Emperor Constantine's forces fighting within the city. So there was and you had Western and Eastern Christian dying side by side in 1453. So there was somewhat of a reconciliation, But I think what happened was with the takeover of the Ottoman Turks and the rise of the Ottoman Empire and just the complete destruction of anything that once was Byzantium, the bad blood had nothing else to compare it to. And once you're sitting under 500 years of Ottoman oppression, it becomes very easy to kind of sit back and go, gee, how did this happen? Oh, yeah, the Latins came in 1204 and completely wrecked everything.
Well, and
so
something that is interesting is that while the Greeks, actually the Greek Orthodox folks, are not as upset about it as you might think. It's really the Russian Orthodox. The Russians, like basically from the get-go, the Russian Primary Chronicle records this as like the worst thing that's ever happened in the entire history of the world, 1204. And ever since that point, of course, the Duke of Novgorod was married to a younger daughter of the Angeloi, and basically at that point decided that therefore I'm going to be the new emperor. They have had this idea, which ultimately resulted in them calling themselves Caesar or Tsar, that they have to be taking up this mantle that was the mantle of Rome, and that you can't trust the West. You can't trust the West. You can't trust these Latins. Certainly can't trust the Turks as a result of the 1453. It's actually like the Russian tradition is the one that is the most hostile to the Western, to the Latin Empire, even more than the Greek tradition.
Interesting. Paul, did you have any comments on this particular issue?
I think that I will expand a little bit on what Rand and Joe have mentioned in terms of the gulf that opens up. Rand certainly experienced it firsthand, and Joe mentioned it. Theology is one thing, but the sack of Constantinople is basically another thing entirely. About the only person that I would argue about it, the only culture or group that the Eastern Christians might despise more than the Latin Christians for the sack and fall of Constantinople are probably the Turks, and that's only because they did it more recently, and they lasted longer, But at the same time, that I think that this sack of Constantinople really created the environment in which the reconciliation. I mean, it was only in 1974 that mutual excommunication was lifted, and the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church in the West were sort of reconciled, at least on the basis of no longer hating each other officially. I mean, that was lifted in 1974. I think we would have seen that centuries earlier had the Fourth Crusade just gone on to Egypt and satisfied the Venetians with plunder from the Egyptian cities like Alexandria and
that would have been so much better.
Cairo. I really
made it much better.
I think that we would have seen I think that we would have seen a reunification there, and I think that reunification with that reunification and that sort of renewed sense of purpose, we could have seen the entire crusading endeavor in Outremer, especially around with the new push at the end of the 13th century. I think that would have turned out very differently had the Byzantine Empire been in a position to lend more aid. But as Joe mentioned, the political divisions really hampered the ability of the Byzantines to lend any sort of support in 1291 because they're split up into these different warring factions. They're split up into the Latin kingdom. You have all of these different groups, and that's what really, there's no base of operations anymore when the Turks start to push and wind up kicking the last Crusaders out of Acre in 1291. The Byzantine Empire, at least while it was intact, even if it was sometimes double dealing behind the Crusaders' backs, it was at least a safe port for the most part. It was the staging area. It was a good place to rest, resupply, and start launching attacks out. Everybody benefited from the Byzantine Empire staying afloat, except for these Venetians that were pushing for this particular attack. And something that was not mentioned earlier, but I've often wondered is how much of this was the Byzantine Empire falling because the Venetians wanted a basis of power to their backs. The Holy Roman Empire to the north was certainly hostile to Italy, to northern Italy. They laid claim to a large chunk of northern Italy throughout their history. So you have these Venetians in northern Italy, and you have off to the north these hostile people. You have throughout Italy, you have these hostile city-states. You have Florence, you have Rome, you have Naples, you have Genoa. You have all of these different city-states within Rome, within the Italian peninsula itself, that are all competing against Venice. And here's Venice's golden opportunity. And I don't think they really care about the consequences between East and West. They're looking at it purely politically and geographically, that they can, put into position people that will counterbalance that Holy Roman Empire in the north, and give them a good, solid marketplace and a good inroad to the Silk Road in the east. And they have their backs secure with a Latin kingdom in the east. And I don't think they really cared at all about the consequences. And unfortunately, the rest of the world suffered from their lack of concern.
Yeah, that's a good point, Paul. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, as we've looked at the Fourth Crusade, that the events that transpired, I mean, the conquest of Constantinople, Venice was really looking at this as just an issue of its immediate political concerns, and I think that's pretty unavoidable. So, well, I think that's going to pretty much bring us to the end of this discussion of this podcast. This has been a really, really good discussion. As usual, you guys all had great comments, so I'm glad that I was able to have each of you on. This has been the final discussion of the Fourth Crusade. We have gone over the Fourth Crusade, and I think we've covered it fairly well. So I'm glad to have each of you on board for that. Rand, I just want to say I appreciate you helping out with this as usual. Glad to have you.
Absolutely. It's always awesome to be on.
And Paul, I'm glad you could be with us as well. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
And Joe, it was great to hear your comments as well. Thanks for being a part of this.
Thanks so much. That was a lot of fun.
Good. Well, we'll have to do something else. We'll have to come up with another topic in the Crusades. I don't know. We've done a podcast about the Third Crusade, about the Fourth Crusade now. I don't know. Maybe
Albigensian Crusade.
I'm sorry.
I said the Albigensian Crusade.
Yeah. I don't know. I could see doing a series about the Fifth Crusade. That's a good one.
Yeah, or even maybe one that can focus on some not quite so depressing, although it will be depressing in the long term. But the Ninth Crusade, the last one, Prince Edward, future King Edward I of England.
That is a good one.
Almost coming close to becoming a second Richard.
Will counterbalance that Holy Roman Empire in the north, and give them a good, solid marketplace and a good